The sequence of events in 1914 leading from peace in Europe to the general outbreak of war occurred very quickly. It all started in Sarajevo on June 28th. A Serbian nationalist assassinated Austrian Archduke Francis Ferdinand, the heir apparent to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and his wife. Then in Vienna, on July 23rd, the Austrian government issued an ultimatum threatening war against Serbia, and then Austria-Hungary invaded Serbia 4 days after that. Germany and Bulgaria were allied to Austria-Hungary. In St. Petersburg on July 31st, Russia, as an ally of Serbia, ordered its army to mobilize against Austria. And because Germany was Austria's ally, they declared war against Russia. Germany then declares war against France, an ally of Russia, and they immediately began an invasion of neutral Belgium. Because Belgium was in between Germany and France, it offered the fastest route to Paris. Oops, wrong way. Then Great Britain, as an ally of France, declared war against Germany. And with Britain, I keep going the wrong way, came all of Britain's colonies. Later, Japan entered the war, and then the United States entered the war in 1917, and then Italy also joined up. So what you have here are two competing alliances. The assassination of the Archduke sparked the war, but the underlying causes were militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. The combination of public and secret alliances, seen here, Central Powers and Allied Powers, pulled all of the major European powers into war before calm minds could prevent it. It was a tragedy that haunted generations of future leaders, and that motivated President Woodrow Wilson to search for a lasting peace. President Wilson's first response to the outbreak of the European War was a declaration of U.S. neutrality, the tradition of Washington and Jefferson, and he called upon the American people to support his policy by not taking sides. However, in trying to steer a neutral course, Wilson soon found that it was difficult, if not impossible, to protect U.S. trading rights and maintain a policy that favored neither the Allied powers nor the Central Powers. During a relatively short period from 1914 to 1919, the United States and its people rapidly moved through a wide range of roles. First as a contented neutral country, then as a country waging a war for peace, then as a victorious world power, and finally as an alienated and isolationist nation. In World War I, as in the War of 1812, the trouble for the United States arose as the belligerent powers tried to stop supplies from reaching the enemy. Having the stronger navy, Great Britain was the first to declare a naval blockade against Germany by mining the North Sea and seizing ships, including U.S. ships, attempting to run the blockade. President Wilson protested British seizure of American ships as a violation of a neutral nation's right to freedom of the seas. Germany's one hope for challenging British power at sea lay with a new naval weapon, the submarine. In February of 1915, Germany answered the British blockade by announcing a blockade of its own, and warned that ships attempting to enter the war zone, waters near the British Isles, risked being sunk on sight by German submarines. The first major crisis challenging U.S. neutrality occurred on May 7, 1915, when German torpedoes hit and sank a British passenger liner, the Lusitania. Most of the passengers drowned, including 128 Americans. In response, Wilson sent Germany a strongly worded diplomatic message, warning that Germany would be held to strict accountability if it continued its policy of sinking unarmed ships. The Secretary of State at the time was William Jennings Bryan, and he objected to the message because he saw it as too warlike, and William Jennings Bryan resigned from the president's cabinet as a result. Later on, in August of 1915, 2 more Americans lost their lives as a result of a German submarine attack on another passenger ship called the Arabic, This time, Wilson's note of protest prevailed upon the German government to pledge that no unarmed passenger ships would be sunk without warning. This would allow time for passengers to get into lifeboats. Germany kept its word until March of 1916, when a German torpedo struck an unarmed merchant ship called the Sussex. When the Sussex was torpedoed, it injured several American passengers. Wilson threatened to cut off U.S. diplomatic relations with Germany, which was a step preparing the United States to enter the war. But once again, rather than risk U.S. entry into the war on the British side, Germany backed it down. Its reply to the President, which was known as the Sussex Pledge, promised not to sink merchant or passenger ships without giving due warning. For the remainder of 1916, Germany was true to its word. Even though the United States was officially a neutral nation, its economy became closely tied to that of the Allied powers, specifically Great Britain and France. In early 1914, before the war began, the United States had been in a business recession. Soon after the outbreak of war, the economy rebounded, in part because of orders for war supplies from the British and the French. By 1915, U.S. businesses had never been so prosperous. In theory, U.S. manufacturers could have shipped supplies to Germany as well, but the British blockade effectively prevented such trade. Wilson's policy did not deliberately favor the Allied powers. Nevertheless, because the President more or less tolerated the British blockade while restricting Germany's submarine blockade, U.S. economic support was going to one side, Britain and France, and not the other. Between 1914 and 1917, U.S. trade with the Allies quadrupled, while its trade with Germany dwindled to the vanishing point. In addition, when the Allies could not finance the purchase of everything they needed, the U.S. government permitted J.P. Morgan and other bankers to extend as much as $3 billion in secured credit to Britain and France. These loans promoted U.S. prosperity as they sustained the Allies' war effort. If Wilson's policies favored Britain, so did the attitudes of most Americans. In August of 1914, as Americans read in their newspapers about German armies marching ruthlessly through Belgium, they perceived Germany as a cruel bully whose armies were commanded by a mean-spirited autocrat, Kaiser Wilhelm. The sinking of the Lusitania reinforced the negative view of Germany. In 1914, first- and second-generation immigrants made up over 30% of the U.S. population. They were glad to be out of the fighting and strongly supported neutrality. Even so, their sympathies reflected their ancestries. For example, German Americans strongly identified with the struggles of their homeland, and many Irish Americans who hated Britain because of its oppressive rule of Ireland openly backed the Central Powers. On the other hand, when Italy joined the Allies in 1915, Italian Americans began cheering on the Allies in their desperate struggle to fend off German assaults on the Western Front. Overall, though, the majority of native-born Americans wanted the Allies to win. Positive U.S. relations with France since the Revolutionary War bolstered public support for the French. Americans also tended to sympathize with Britain and France because of their democratic governments. President Wilson himself, as a person of Scotch-English descent, had long admired the British political system. Not only did Britain command the seas, but it also commanded the war news that was cabled daily to the U.S. newspapers and magazines. Fully recognizing the importance of influencing U.S. public opinion, the British government made sure the American press was well supplied with stories of German soldiers committing atrocities in Belgium and the German-occupied part of eastern France. After the Lusitania crisis, a very small but vocal minority of influential Republicans from the East, including Theodore Roosevelt, argued for U.S. entry into the war against Germany. Foreign policy realists believed that a German victory would change the balance of power, and the United States needed a strong British Navy to protect the status quo. However, the majority of Americans remained thankful for a booming economy and peace. Eastern Republicans such as Roosevelt were the first to recognize that the U.S. military was hopelessly unprepared for a major war. They clamored for preparedness soon after the European War broke out. At first, President Wilson opposed the call for preparedness, but in late 1915 he changed his policy. Wilson urged Congress to approve an ambitious expansion of the armed forces. The president's proposal provoked a storm of controversy, especially among Democrats, who until then were largely opposed to military increases. After a nationwide speaking tour on behalf of preparedness, Wilson finally convinced Congress to pass the National Defense Act in June of 1916, which increased the regular army to a force of nearly 175,000. A month later, Congress approved the construction of more than 50 warships in just 1 year. Many Americans, especially in the Midwest and West, were adamantly opposed to preparedness, fearing that it would soon lead to U.S. involvement in the war. The anti-war activists included populists, progressives, and socialists. Leaders among the peace-minded progressives were people like William Jennings Bryan, Jane Addams. Women suffragists actively campaigned against any military buildup as well. Although after the U.S. declaration of war in 1917, they did support the war effort. President Wilson was well aware that as a Democrat he had won election in the presidency in 1912 only because of the split in Republican ranks. Despite his own progressive record, Wilson's chances for re-election did not seem strong after Theodore Roosevelt declined the Progressive Party's nomination for president in 1916 and then rejoined the Republicans. Roosevelt's decision virtually destroyed any chance of the Progressive Party surviving. The Democrats adopted as their campaign slogan, "He kept us out of war." The peace sentiment in the country, Wilson's record of progressive leadership, combined to give the president the victory in an extremely close election. Democratic strength in the South and the West overcame Republican power in the East. Wilson made repeated efforts to fulfill his party's campaign promise to keep the United States out of war. Before the election in 1915, he had sent his chief foreign policy advisor to negotiate a peace settlement. The mission, however, had been unsuccessful. Other efforts at mediation were also turned aside by both the Allies and the Central Powers. Finally, in January of 1917, Wilson made a speech to the Senate, declaring the U.S. commitment to his idealistic hope for peace without victory. In April of 1917, only 1 month after being sworn into office a second time, President Wilson went before Congress to ask for a declaration of war against Germany. What had happened to change his policy from neutrality to war? Most important in the U.S. decision for war was a sudden change in German military strategy. The German High Command had decided in early January 1917 to resume unrestricted submarine warfare. Germany recognized the risk of the United States entering the war, but believed that by cutting off supplies to the Allies, they could win the war before Americans could react. Germany communicated its decision to the U.S. government on January 31st. A few days later, Wilson broke off U.S. diplomatic relations with Germany. Wilson still hesitated, but a series of events in March of 1917, as well as his hopes for arranging a permanent peace in Europe, convinced Wilson that U.S. participation in the war was now unavoidable. It was on March 1st that U.S. newspapers carried the shocking news of a secret offer made by Germany to Mexico. Intercepted by British intelligence, this telegram to Mexico from the German Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann proposed that Mexico ally itself with Germany in return for Germany's pledge to help Mexico recover lost territories: Texas, New Mexico, Arizona. The Zimmermann telegram aroused the nationalist anger of the American people and convinced Wilson that Germany fully expected a war with the United States. Applying the principle of moral diplomacy, Wilson wanted the war to be fought for a worthy purpose, the triumph of democracy. It bothered him that one of the allies was Russia, a nation governed by an autocratic czar. This barrier to U.S. participation was suddenly removed on March 15th, when Russian revolutionaries overthrew the Tsar's government and proclaimed a republic. Only later